for the United Nations Security Council holding an open debate to discuss the recent escalation of violence in Israel, Gaza and the Middle East. Let's go there right now.
This round of violence only perpetuates the cycles of death, destruction and despair, and pushes farther to the horizon any hopes of coexistence and peace. Fighting must stop. It must stop immediately. Rockets and mortars on one side, aerial and artillery bombardments on the other must stop. I appeal to all parties to heed this call. The United Nations is actively engaging all sides towards an immediate ceasefire. The hostilities have already caused unconscionable death, immense suffering, and damage to vital infrastructure. I'm appalled by the increasingly large number of Palestinian civilian casualties, including many women and children, from Israeli strikes in Gaza. And I also deplore Israeli fatalities from rockets launched from Gaza. I'm also deeply concerned by violent clashes between Israeli security forces and Palestinians across the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, where some Palestinian families are under threat of eviction. In Israel, violence by military-style groups and mobs have added to a further horrendous dimension to an already deteriorating crisis. Leaders on all sides have a responsibility to curb inflammatory rhetoric and calm the rising tensions. The fighting risks dragging Israelis and Palestinians into a spiral of violence with devastating consequences for both communities and for the entire region. It has the potential to unleash an uncontainable security and humanitarian crisis and to further foster extremism, not only in the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel, but in the region as a whole, potentially creating a new world of dangerous instability. The hostilities have forced thousands of Palestinians to leave their homes in Gaza and shelter in schools, mosques, and other places with limited access to water, food, hygiene, and oral services. Hospitals are already overstretched due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and meanwhile, Israeli civilians live in fear of rockets launched from Gaza. I am appalled by the attack on a refugee camp in Gaza in which 10 members of one family were killed. Humanitarian installations must be protected. Journalists must be allowed to work free of fear and harassment. The destruction of media offices in Gaza is extremely concerning. This senseless cycle of bloodshed, terror and destruction must stop immediately. All parties must respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The status quo at the holy sites must be upheld and respected. And my special coordinator will brief you today on the latest developments on the ground and our effort to de-escalate the situation. Let me reiterate that the United Nations remains deeply committed to working with Israelis and Palestinians and with our international and regional partners, including the Middle East Quartet, to realize a lasting and just peace. We are in contact with many relevant interlocutors, and I again call on the parties to allow mediation efforts to intensify and succeed. The only way forward is to return to negotiations with the goal of a two-state solution, leaving two states side by side in peace, security, and mutual recognition, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states, all based on relevant UN resolutions, international law, and prior agreements. The longer this cycle of violence continues, the more challenging it will be to reach that ultimate goal. Only a negotiated, sustainable political solution will end once and for all these devastating cycles of violence and lead to a peaceful future for Palestinians and Israelis alike. And I thank you.
I thank Secretary General for his briefing. I now invite Mr. Tor Wennesland, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, to brief the meeting. Please.
Mr. President, Excellencies, members of the Security Council. The past week has seen a deadly escalation between Israeli military forces and Palestinian armed groups in Gaza. That is the most serious we have seen in years. We have also witnessed dramatic scenes of violence across the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Tensions have been ongoing for weeks. In the Sheikh Sharon neighborhood of East Jerusalem, there have been protests and clashes over the threat of Palestinian eviction commenced by settlers organizations in the Old City, including in the Holy Esplanada, there have been violent clashes between Palestinians and Israeli civilians and police. Police deployed a heavy presence in the area in the context of a large number of visitors for Ramadan prayers, protests, and Israeli extremist demonstrations, leading to clashes. With some 181 Palestinians and 9 Israelis killed as a result of Israeli airstrikes and Palestinian militant rockets, based on preliminary figures, the toll of this deadly confrontation is already too high. I extend my sincere condolences to the families of all those who have lost loved ones in the violence. Mr. President, since 10 May, according to Israeli official sources, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other militants have launched over 2,900 indiscriminate rockets from the Gaza Strip towards Israel. 9 Israelis, including 5 women and 2 children, and 1 Indian national were killed and over 250 injured, 23 severely wounded. Civilians across the south and the center of the country have been repeatedly sent to shelter. An anti-tank missiles fired at a vehicle near the Gaza perimeter fence killed an Israeli soldier and injured 2 others. The rockets have reached as far as the outskirts of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv and its suburbs and Ben Gurion Airport. While a significant number of rockets were intercepted by Iron Dome, some 450 fell short inside Gaza, accounting for some Palestinian casualties, according to the Israeli Defense Forces. Direct hits have been reported in multiple locations, causing damage to residential and commercial property, as well as schools and crude oil pipelines. In Gaza, the humanitarian and security situation is more dire by the day. In response to the Palestinian militant rockets attacks that began on 10 May, the IDF has conducted over 950 strikes against what is said were militant targets, including weapon factories and depots, tunnel networks, Hamas training facilities, intelligence and security headquarters, and offices of homes of senior Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives. These strikes have killed over 100 operatives, including senior commanders, according to the IDF. Nevertheless, the civilian death tolls, including children, continue to mount. As of this afternoon, local times, health authorities in Gaza report 181 Palestinians, including at least 52 children and 31 women and a person with disabilities killed, and 1,200 injured by these strikes. The population must repeatedly try to find cover from strikes absent proper shelters, and over 34,000 people have been displaced from their homes. Over 40 UNRWA schools are now open in Gaza as shelters with limited access to water and no access to health care or food, and serve for protection purposes only. The dense and closed context of Gaza makes seeking shelters all the more difficult. As a result of the military operation, 7 factories, 40 schools, and at least 4 hospitals have sustained complete or partial damage. At least 18 buildings, including 4 high-rise towers, including one hosting international media outlets, have been destroyed, and over 350 buildings damaged. According to the IDF, these buildings contain Hamas military installations. Mr. President, reports continue of families, women, children, and infants killed in their homes by airstrikes. Early this morning, several houses were struck while residents were inside, killing 12 people and injuring over 50 others. I note also the death yesterday of 9 family members, 2 women and 7 children in the Al-Shatia camp, among so many others. In Israel, a 5-year-old boy was killed by a rocket in Sderot, and a 16-year-old girl and her father were killed in Lot. Such tragedies are unacceptable and cannot be justified nor measured. Mr. President, these escalations have already produced tragic results. A further intensification of hostilities would have devastating consequences for both Palestinians and Israelis. The United Nations is working tireless with all sides to restore calm. I reiterate the Secretary General's urgent call on Israel and Palestinian armed groups to take immediate and decisive steps to de-escalate the situation and prevent any further loss of life. Israelis and Palestinians have a legitimate right to safety and security. The violence we are witnessing now is unacceptable and unjustifiable. Hamas and other militants' indiscriminate launching of rockets and mortars from highly populated civilian neighborhoods into civilian populated centers in Israel violates international humanitarian law and must cease immediately. Civilian areas must never be used for military purposes. Israeli authorities must abide by international humanitarian law principles governing armed conflict, including the proportional use of force, exercising maximum restraint to spare civilians and civilian objects, and the conduct of military operations. I reiterate that children should not be the target of violence or put in harm's way. Mr. President, turning briefly to ongoing regional dynamics, on 13 May, the IDF informed that 3 rockets were fired from Lebanon into the sea off the coast of northern Israel. Lebanese armed forces confirmed the firing and reporting findings materials close to a Palestinian refugee camp in Rashidia. On 14 May, up to 100 individuals protested north of the Blue Line, some waving Palestinian and Hezbollah flags. UNIFIL observed several protesters crossing the Blue Line close to the town of Metula. IDF personnel fired multiple warning shots, reportedly injuring 2. According to Lebanese authorities, 1, a Lebanese citizen, later died. The Lebanese armed forces arrested several protesters following the incidents. In addition, 3 rockets were launched from Syria. There were no reports of damage or injuries. Mass protests in solidarity with Palestinians also occurred at the Israeli borders with Jordan, where thousands of Jordanians marched towards the bridge connecting Jordan to the occupied West Bank, but were reportedly stopped short by the Jordanian security forces. Mr. President, violence in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continued to increase. Since 10 May, 19 Palestinians were killed, including 2 children, and some 1,844 Palestinians were injured in the West Bank by Israeli security forces in either clashes or other incidences, 444 of these by live ammunition. At least 8 Israelis were injured in these incidences, according to Israeli government sources. On 10 May, amid heavy presence of Israeli security forces ahead of planned Jerusalem Day March, thousands of Palestinians clashed with police in and around the Holy Esplanade and other parts of the Old City. ISF reportedly shot and injured over 650 Palestinians with rubber-coated metal bullets and other crowd-controlled means. 32 ISF personnel were injured in these clashes, although Israeli authorities took steps to reroute the Jerusalem Day marches, leading to their cancellation. Tensions continued, particularly within the Holy Esplanade. In Sheikh Jarrah, ISF dispersed demonstrators using sunk water, sponge-tipped bullets and stun grenades. One Palestinian was killed and another shot and injured in separate incidences after they attempted to attack Israeli soldiers. On 14 May, violence is escalated as Palestinians held a day of rage in support of Gaza, with clashes between Palestinians and ISF in Qalqilia, Ramallah, Nablus, Bethlehem, Hebron, and dozens of other locations. 10 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces, in addition to 1 Palestinian killed near Ufra's settlement in an alleged stabbed attack against ISF. This is the highest number of Palestinian fatalities recorded in a single day in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, since UN began recording fatalities in 2008. Mr. President, turning again to Gaza, the damage to infrastructure in the Strip has been substantial, and a humanitarian emergency is unfolding. The Gaza power plant is operating at reduced capacity due to Israel's closure of Kerem Shalom crossing. Reports from Gaza suggest rolling daily power cuts of 5 to 6 hours in some areas. With current stocks, it could operate at reduced capacity for another 4 days only. The lack of electricity has resulted in a decrease of clean water and sewage treatment affecting hundreds of thousands. The health system, already overwhelmed by chronic drug shortages, inadequate equipment and COVID-19 pandemic, will likely be unable to meet the needs of those injured during the violence, particularly as hospitals face equipment and electricity shortage. Since 10 May, Israeli authorities have kept Gaza Crossing for people and goods closed. This includes humanitarian personnel and critical aid, such as fuel and medical supplies. The fishing zones off the coast of Gaza also remain closed. The Rafah crossing was closed 12th of May and reopened this morning. It is vital that, mindful of its security concerns, Israel opened the crossing for movement of critical staff in and out of Gaza and for the entry of fuel for the Gaza power plant. The UN must also be able to bring in key items needed for trauma care and to adequately supply shelters given the huge influx of IDPs. It requires a pause in fighting to allow limited movement for a restock of supplies and to assess damage and needs, including to electricity infrastructure. I remind all sides that the UN and its partners have nearly completed a massive multi-billion-dollar reconstruction effort following the 2014 conflict. Given the range of current global challenges, an outpouring of international support on the same scale is highly unlikely. All sides should be mindful of this as the fighting and destruction continues. Mr. President, we cannot allow the situation to slide further into chaos. The hostilities must stop. I reiterate the appeal just given by the Secretary General for an immediate cessation of hostilities and for his dire warning that this conflict will increase radicalization and extremism in the whole region. The international community has a crucial role to play. It must take action now to enable the parties to step back from the brink. I welcome the statements from members of the Security Council, the Arab League, and others aimed at finding a diplomatic solution to the immediate crisis. I also appreciate the efforts of leaders across the international community over the past days, urging all parties to exercise restraints, de-escalate tension, and prevent further civilian casualties. Mr. President, we are once again witnessing the tragic results of the failure to address the core issues that have driven the conflict for decades. Palestinian and Israeli civilians continue to endure the suffering that accompanies repeated cycles of violence and conflict. These cycles of violence will only stop with a political resolution to the conflict, including addressing the status of Jerusalem and other final status issues, with an end to the occupation and the realization of a two-state solution on the basis of the 1967 lines, UN resolutions, international law, and mutual agreements with Israel as capital of both Israel and Palestine. I reiterate my call to the members of the Middle East Quartet, key Arabs and international partners, as well as to Israel and Palestinian leadership to strengthen efforts to return to meaningful negotiations towards a viable two-state solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Special Coordinator, for your briefing. I now give the floor to Observer State of Palestine, His Excellency Mr. Al-Malki, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates. Please.
Mr. President, allow me to thank China for convening this important meeting and for being represented at ministerial level, as well as Tunisia for their relentless efforts within this council, and my Arab brothers who decided to participate in this meeting as an integral part of their efforts to end aggression against our people, land, and holy sites. Allow me also to thank the Secretary General for his participation and ongoing efforts, together with the UN Special Coordinator, to end this latest aggression against our people. I do acknowledge the presence of the foreign ministers of the Kingdom of Norway and the Republic of Ireland and the Deputy Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation. Mr. President, there are no words that can describe the horrors our people are enduring. Baby Omar al-Hadidi came to life only 5 months ago and will now have to go through life without his mother and brothers Osama, 6 years old, Abdurrahman, 8, Suhaib, 14, all killed by an Israeli airstrike. His family is not the only one. Members of the family Abu Hatab were killed, including Ala, 5 years old, Bilal, 10, Yusuf, 11, and the family Al-Banani. Rawiya was 4 months pregnant. She was killed together with her husband and sons, Ismail, 6 years old, Amir, 5, Adham, 4, Muhammad, 3. Few hours ago, 15 members of the family Al-Qulaq were killed, including Zaid, 8 years old, Adam, 3, and Qusay, 1 year old, and their parents. Aziz survived, he is 10. When you embrace your children and grandchildren tonight, please think of our children and of how you can honor those killed and spare those still alive. Think of what it feels to see your world crumbling down and not being able to protect them. Think of what it means to sleep not knowing which one of you will wake up. Remember that each time Israel hears a foreign leader speak of its right to defend itself, it is further emboldened to continue murdering entire families in their sleep. Israel is killing Palestinians in Gaza, one family at a time. Israel is trying to uproot Palestinians from Jerusalem, expelling families, one home, one neighborhood at a time. Israel is persecuting our people, committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. Some may not want to use these words, war crimes and crimes against humanity, but they know they are true. Israel is unapologetic and relentless in pursuing its colonial policies. We are therefore left with two questions. The first one is, what are the Palestinian people entitled to do to resist such policies and defend themselves? The following questions hold the answer. Is violence when committed by Palestinians terrorism, and when committed by Israel self-defense? Who will be arrested, the settlers or those resisting their presence and assaults? Will our peaceful protesters enjoy international protection or be left to face Israeli bullets and slander? Will we receive support for investigations by the ICC, or will some search for reasons to object, shielding war criminals and depriving Palestinian victims from any avenue for justice? Will products of Israeli settlements be banned, or will those who call for boycott be prosecuted? What are we entitled to do apart from hoping that one day Israel will be ready to end its occupation on its own and to negotiate peace? The second question is, what are the tools the international community is ready to deploy to ensure compliance by Israel with its obligations and an end of its occupation? Tools it uses regularly in other conflicts. Military interventions, sanctions, maybe. Suspending bilateral relations, maybe. Prosecuting perpetrators of crimes, maybe. Deploying protection forces, maybe. Imposing an arms embargo, maybe. Or will it rely simply on the possibility of convincing the occupying power to end its colonial occupation, while history has proven that Israel is not willing to listen? Mr. President, Israel keeps doing the same things, expecting a different result. Did it believe that its troops storming the holiest of sites, Al-Aqsa Mosque, on the holiest of months, Ramadan, and on the holiest of nights, the night of destiny, would bear no consequences? Did it believe Palestinians would accept to live in enclaves and wait for the Israeli settlers to seize the next house? Did they expect Palestinians to coexist with the occupation, its walls, its blockades, its settlements, and its prisons? There is no people on earth that would tolerate this reality. No people on earth. Israel keeps telling you, put yourself in our shoes. This is what they say all the time. Put yourself in our shoes. But Israel is not wearing shoes. It is wearing military boots. It is an occupying and a colonial power. Any assessment of the situation that fails to take into account this fundamental fact is biased, discredited, and unjust. We are not two neighbors living side by side in peace. Israel is the armed thief who has entered our house and is terrorizing our family. It destroys our homes, oppresses our people, generation after generation, decades after decades, and then claims a right to security that it denies us. Why don't you put yourself on our shoes? What would you do if your country was occupied, your people persecuted, besieged, massacred? Better yet, what did you do to achieve your independence and end the oppression of your people? We made a different choice to pursue a peaceful path to freedom, and it is in everybody's interest for that path to be successful. But that will not happen without ensuring that Israel bears the cost of occupation instead of reaping its benefits. Mr. President, How many Palestinian civilians killed is enough for a condemnation. We know a single Israeli is, but how many Palestinians? 200 Palestinians have been killed, a third of them children and women. What is the threshold for outrage? An entire family wiped out of existence is not enough. Dozens of families killed is not enough. Residential buildings brought to the ground and tens of thousands of Palestinians displaced for the fourth or fifth time is not enough. All this in the midst of a pandemic. Israel is not only an occupying power. Israel is a nuclear power. It has a military arsenal, the Iron Dome, shelters, while our people in Gaza are besieged, trapped, with nowhere to go and no safe haven. Even the UNRWA schools within which they shelter are vulnerable to Israeli attacks. It is Palestinian civilians who need protection. They deserve compassion. They deserve solidarity and action. The Palestinian people have risen everywhere because they are victims everywhere. Victims of dispossession, forced displacement, discrimination and denial of rights on both sides of the Green Line and in exile. When hearing Israeli officials speak, one could wonder how horrible it must be for them to live under our occupation. With our forces deployed in their streets and our settlers terrorizing their people and taking over their land and homes, and with millions of them under blockade. As many colonial powers before it, Israel holds its victims responsible for their own death. Israel is the victim forced to kill the Palestinians because they do not behave. If only Palestinians could coexist with their occupiers and oppressor in peace. Some wonder why Palestine enjoys so much solidarity and support from so many nations around the world. And the reason is that these nations are informed by their own history, their own struggle for freedom, and they know oppression when they see it. The countries who sit in these United Nations would be dishonoring the memory of those who fought for freedom in their respective countries if they were to accept colonialism and apartheid in Palestine. Mr. President, where are they, those who proclaimed they had achieved peace in the Middle East by brokering agreements between countries who were actually not at war? Where are they, those who proclaimed that peace in the Middle East could be achieved without the Palestinians and at their expense? Where are they, those real estate agents who decided they could sell what they do not own to those who have no rightful claim? We told them then, and we say now, Jerusalem is not for sale. Our roots are deep, our history long, our heritage etched in every stone, in every street and alley in this city. War and peace start from Jerusalem. You want to save peace? Start by saving Sheikh Jarrah. Protect Al-Haram Sharif from attempts to divide it temporarily and spatially. Israel continues proclaiming that Jerusalem is a unified capital of Israel. Have you ever seen the city more divided? The international consensus you have all helped shape and defend is being destroyed in front of our very eyes. The alternative that Israel chose is apartheid. Yes, apartheid. And one day soon, even this council will not be able to deny this reality. Act now to end the aggression and the assault on our people, our homes, our land. Act now so freedom can prevail, not apartheid. Mr. President, as the Palestinian people mark the 73rd anniversary of the Nakba, the catastrophe, Israel pursues the same policies of disposition, forced displacement, discrimination, and denial of Palestinian rights. Israel may believe it is winning, but it is nowhere closer to defeating the Palestinian people. Our people will never surrender or forgo their rights. Palestinian freedom is the only path to peace. Since peace is the responsibility of this council, your council, helping achieve Palestinian freedom is its legal and moral duty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is Nadine Awad, a 16-year-old girl, an Arab citizen of Israel. She was studying biology and chemistry, and she dreamed of changing the world. She was murdered last Wednesday by the radical jihadi terrorist group Hamas. A Hamas rocket slammed into her home in central Israel, killing her and her father. Over the last week, millions of Israeli children, women, and men have been huddling in bomb shelters, while thousands of Hamas rockets landed all around them. Hamas has murdered 10 people in Israel, Jews and Arabs, and hundreds of its rockets have fallen short upon the people of Gaza itself, killing Palestinian children and destroying Palestinian homes. Hamas is carrying out its terror attacks while hiding behind Palestinian houses, schools, and hospitals, deliberately using civilians as human shields. Just before I arrived here today, I called my elderly parents who live in the southern city of Ashkelon and have just 30 seconds to reach a bomb shelter each time Hamas attacks. Member of the Security Council, let me ask you, what would you do if thousands of terrorist rockets were being fired at your country, at your people, at your parents or children? How would you respond if an organization with a similar fanatic jihadist ideology as ISIS was bombing Beijing or Moscow or Dublin and shutting down the airports of Paris or Oslo or London? What would you expect the Security Council to do? Mr. President, this is not the first time that Hamas has indiscriminately fired deadly missiles at Israeli civilians while hiding behind Palestinian civilians. But this time, it's different. It was completely premeditated by Hamas in order to gain political power. It was all a part of their vicious plan. While Hamas seeks the destruction of the state of Israel, it's also vying to take power in the West Bank and to replace the Palestinian Authority. Hamas was frustrated last month when President Abbas postponed Palestinian elections after not holding them for 15 years. It looked for another way to seize power. So, unfortunately, it chose to escalate tensions in Jerusalem as a pretext to start this war. Suddenly, Hamas leader Mohammed Def, who has been silent for years, was threatening Israel would pay a heavy price if an Israeli court went ahead and ruled on a property dispute in Jerusalem. Now let me be clear. Israel is a country of law with a robust and independent judiciary. As in any democracy, the Israeli government does not interfere with court proceedings. Everyone knows that. Buying into Hamas's political propaganda ploy to portray the massive, unprovoked rocket attacks as a result of the dispute in Sheikh Jarrah is not only wrong, it is dangerous. It sends a disturbing message. There is never an excuse to indiscriminately fire rockets at civilians. There is never a justification for terror. Do you really believe that this property dispute is what caused Hamas to launch these large-scale attacks on the people of Israel? So after threatening Israel over Sheikh Jarrah, Hamas's next move was to incite violence on the Temple Mount, the holiest site in the world for Jews and one of the holiest for Muslims. Palestinian extremists turned the Al-Aqsa Mosque into a site for stockpiling weapons and launched violent attacks with firebombs and rocks against Jewish worshippers and against the Israeli police. Here is a photo of the stones and other weapons which Palestinian rioters placed in Al-Aqsa, desecrating this holy site and endangering the safety of all worshippers. The Israeli police had no choice but to intervene to restore order and ensure that both Jewish and Muslim worshippers could pray in peace. Using non-lethal means, our police was able to disperse the violent riots without a single fatality. Without a single fatality. I doubt whether there are many police forces anywhere in the world that could have achieved such an outcome. I want to emphasize, Israel deeply cherishes freedom of religion. Every year, during Ramadan and throughout the year, hundreds of thousands of Muslims are free to pray at their holy site in peace. Even after these extremely violent riots, Israel remains committed to the status quo and to religious freedom for all. Here is another photo of Eid al-Fitr prayers from this past Thursday, showing tens of thousands of Muslims praying at Al-Aqsa. Do you really believe these peaceful prayers is what caused Hamas to launch this large-scale attack on the people of Israel? Israel will continue to uphold the rights of all believers to practice their religion in freedom and security in the holy city of Jerusalem. As opposed to Hamas, which did everything in its power to incite violence, Israel took all possible steps to de-escalate tensions in Jerusalem. In an extremely exceptional move, we made a request to the Supreme Court to delay its hearing on the Sheikh Jarrah case. We rerouted our annual Jerusalem Day Parade and even took the unprecedented, unthinkable step of preventing Jews from entering their holiest site, the Temple Mount, on our national day of celebration. Even today, on the eve of the Jewish festival of Shavuot, where we celebrate receiving the Torah, Jews were prevented from entering the site because of Palestinian terror. And how did Hamas respond to all our efforts to de-escalate? By firing rockets and missiles at Jerusalem, our capital city. This is how it started. It was all planned in advance. Mr. President, for years, Hamas has been using international aid not to help the people of Gaza, but to abuse them. It has built a vast web of underground terror tunnels which snake beneath playgrounds, maternity wards, and mosques with the clear strategic goal of increasing the number of Palestinian civilian casualties when Israel is forced to respond. It is not just Palestinians which Hamas uses as shields. As we have revealed, Hamas is hiding its terror infrastructure, such as intelligence stations and command headquarters in multi-story buildings, including those which house international media, citizens of your own countries. Israel has no choice but to stop these Hamas attacks wherever they are being launched, and it is Hamas who should be held accountable for the consequences. We thank the President of the United States, the administration, and the many other countries that support Israel's right to defend our citizens from this terror. Every time Hamas fires at Israeli civilians while hiding behind Gaza civilians, it is committing a double war crime. It doesn't care where its rockets hit, as long as there is destruction. It doesn't care who the victims are, as long as there are victims. Israel is responding to indiscriminate attacks with precision-targeted strikes against Hamas military targets. We take unparalleled steps to prevent civilian casualties. Not only do we strictly adhere to international law, we go beyond, making phone calls and sending text messages in order to make sure that everyone gets out beforehand. Tragically, at times, despite all our efforts, Hamas's use of human shields results in civilians getting hurt. As an Israeli, a Jew, a father of four, I am deeply pained by the death of every civilian, whether Israeli or Palestinian. But any attempt to compare Israel and Hamas is factually, legally, and morally wrong. Hamas targets civilians. Israel targets terrorists. Israel makes every effort to avoid civilian casualties. Hamas makes every effort to increase civilian casualties. Israel sees every civilian death as a tragedy. Hamas sees every Israeli civilian death as a victory in its campaign of jihad based on its anti-Semitic charter, and every Palestinian civilian death as a victory in its campaign to gain international sympathy. Israel uses its missiles to protect its children. Hamas uses children to protect its missiles. Mr. President, at the same time as we defend ourselves against Hamas rockets, the terror organization has been calling on Israel's Arab citizens to attack Jews. We have seen numerous appalling attacks by Arab citizens of Israel against Jews, including the abhorrent burning of synagogues and multiple lynchings. We have also seen some appalling cases of Jewish violence against our Arab citizens. As Prime Minister Netanyahu said last night, this violence is entirely unacceptable. We are a country of law, and the Israeli police are now working vigorously to stop the violence, arrest the perpetrators, whether Arabs or Jews. Mr. President, this is where we stand now. a massive, unprovoked assault by Hamas, initiated not as a result of any incidents involving Israel, but due to the internal Palestinian political maneuvering. This assault has forced Israel to defend and protect its citizens and strike Hamas's terror machine in order to stop their aggression once and for all. Now let me speak about the future. Israel has always sought peace. Just this year, we signed peace agreements with 4 Muslim countries. In 2005, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip and uprooted all the Jewish communities there in the hope it would bring security. Instead, it brought unending terror attacks by Hamas. You, the members of the Security Council, responsible for maintaining international peace and security, stand today at a critical crossroads. You have 2 choices. You can create false moral equivalence, immoral equivalence, between the actions of a democracy that sanctifies life and those of terrorist organization that glorifies death by calling for restraint on all sides and failing to unequivocally condemn Hamas. If you make this choice, it will lead to the success of Hamas's insidious strategy of firing at Israeli civilians while hiding behind Palestinian civilians. It will lead to the deaths of more innocent Israelis and Palestinians. It will lead to the strengthening of Hamas, the weakening of the Palestinian Authority, and the undermining of the chances for a dialogue. If you choose to avoid condemning Hamas, it will strengthen the radical terror group which aims to overthrow the Palestinian Authority and whose charter explicitly calls for wiping Israel off the map. It will continue the cycle of violence and undermine the chances for peace. But today, you can choose a different path. You can unequivocally condemn Hamas's indiscriminate and unprovoked attacks which threaten Israelis and Palestinians alike. You can choose to support Israel's heroic efforts to defend itself and dismantle Hamas's infrastructure of terror while doing everything to minimize the number of casualties on both sides. You can send a clear message to Hamas that the international community will no longer accept its strategy of turning Palestinian children into human shields and using schools, hospitals, and high-rises to hide its terror machines. You can choose to support a more peaceful future by demanding the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip and insisting on an authority in Gaza that invests in the well-being of the people of Gaza rather than in the destruction of the state of Israel. Israel has already made its choice. We will take all steps necessary to defend our people. Now, the choice is yours. The world is watching. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador from Israel. Next, I will invite Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi from Jordan to speak, please.
In the name of God, the most merciful. Sir, Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, may God's blessing be upon all of you. Israel, the occupying power, shoulders the responsibility for the difficult situation in the occupied Palestinian territories and everything that is caused by the bloodshed and the destruction and the suffering. All of this must stop. The hostilities must stop. The illegitimate practices of Israel must stop. These are the reasons for this escalation of violence. We must act now to do this and to protect the Palestinian people. One thing is sure, given the difficult conditions that the occupied Palestinian territories are experiencing, and given the impossibility of the status quo continuing, given the absence of any future or any prospects for lasting and just peace, given all of this, we deem all Israeli practices to be illegitimate. Lasting peace is a national and regional necessity. Peace, however, cannot be created by settlement activity. This undermines the two-state solution. It represents a grave and clear, flagrant violation of international law. Peace cannot be achieved by confiscating territory. Peace will never come by destroying Palestinians' houses and forcing them to leave. Indeed, peace cannot be achieved by changing the historic status of the different religions' historical sites in Jerusalem. Jerusalem and its holy sites are sacred. Any attempt to undermine this area is something that is provocative for 2 billion Muslims, and for the occupying power, it is Israel's responsibility to protect the status quo there, the status of Jerusalem, and to protect the status quo and the Arab and Islamic identity of its holy sites. It is a sacred task that His Majesty, the King of Jordan, has focused on. It is therefore a precondition in terms of protecting our chance of peace. Mr. President, dear colleagues, as the international community, as the Security Council, we need to shoulder our responsibility. We need to force Israel to respect the rights of the people in Sheikh Jarrah. And in line with international law and IHL, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are civilians and they should be protected. They should not be forced to be displaced. We are talking about a war crime in line with international law, in line with 478 of 1980. And so Israeli evictions has no role here. Let's call things as they are. The occupation is the source of the conflict and is the source and the very heart of the evil here. Peace and justice are diametrically opposed from this. The Palestinian people need to live in freedom. International law needs to be respected. The Security Council resolutions need to be implemented, including 2334. Ladies and gentlemen, another truth that we should accept, all of us, or recognize, is that we cannot neglect Palestine and the Palestinian question. It is the very source of the conflict here. The solution needed is the two-state solution, with a Palestinian state living within the 1967 borders of the 4th of June and pursuant to the relevant Security Council resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative. This is the only way to have lasting and just peace that would meet the needs of all the people in the region. That is why the Security Council needs to act immediately. We need to launch serious negotiations to bring an end to the occupation and to shore up a lasting peace in line with the reference adopted based on the Land for Peace initiative that Israel is currently undermining. There is no time to be lost. The historic injustice inflicted upon the Palestinian people must stop. This inhuman occupation must disappear. These people must live in peace and stability. And the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan is seeking to work with you to establish a lasting, just peace that will meet all the needs of all the peoples living there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. Next, I hope to invite Foreign Minister Shukri from Egypt to speak.
Thank you very much. In the name of God, the Merciful. Councillor of State for Foreign Affairs of China, President of the Security Council, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Foreign Affairs Ministers, Ambassadors, I congratulate the state of China, the friendly state of China, for its presidency of the Security Council during May, and appreciate their efforts in the light of the numerous challenges and crises on the Security Council's agenda. I appreciate the efforts of the Secretary General and his commendable efforts to establish peace in the Middle East, and I appreciate the briefing by Mr. Tor Wennesland, Special Coordinator of the Middle East Peace Process. We are meeting, President, after 70 years since the beginning of the Palestinian tragedy, and around 42 years after the launch of the peace process in the region. At the outset, this process was a very hopeful one towards achieving peace in the region. Unfortunately, this hope has little by little dissipated, with all of the unsuccessful attempts to bring an end to the conflict. In the Palestinian question, which has continued to deteriorate, resulting in greater tension and frustration, which has resulted in the situation we are seeing today. We are meeting after the end of the sacred month of Ramadan, during which we witnessed confrontations and provocation of an unprecedented nature against the faithful and the worshippers in the city of Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Alongside a systematic policy with regard to Arab citizens in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, which resulted in the anger of millions of Arabs and Muslims who have had enough over the last 3 decades of this absenteeism and prevarication with regard to international legal promises regarding serious negotiations about the creation of a Palestinian state on those territories decided upon in before 1967, including East Jerusalem. And we are meeting today with regard to recent developments. This is a military operation and has caused numerous victims in Palestinians in Gaza. And this jeopardizes the achievement of peace and stability in the region. This means that the Council must take into account this crisis situation and must shoulder its responsibilities to bring an end to the current conflict. And de-escalation so that everybody can breathe more freely again, everybody can take a deep breath and think about the causes of the current situation and the lessons learned. And Egypt has always said that there can be no peace in the region without a lasting, just solution. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. The solution exists. It is the two-state solution. Despite everything, this is the only choice which can satisfy all the parties. The threats to regional stability today did not appear overnight. These are the result of a climate of tension and frustration over years of systematic regression and efforts to undermine all attempts to achieve peace in the region. The painful lessons we have learned are the result of this over recent months. And this applies at all levels in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem as a result of the expansion of the settlements and the forced displacement of Palestinians, the confiscation of lands, destruction of institutions and homes, and also Israeli practices which have violated the holy month of Ramadan. As we have seen, the holy esplanade of the Al-Aqsa Mosque has become a battlefield, which is not worthy of the three celestial religions. Because Egypt is fully aware of its responsibility towards its Arab brothers, and we hold a deeply held conviction to fulfill a role to maintain international peace and security, and we have therefore worked at all levels to achieve an immediate ceasefire, to protect the lives of innocent people, so as to come back to a true negotiating table for peace, to reach a solution, rather than to maintain a very precarious situation where it is the innocent who have paid the highest price. There is no other means to resume peace and security except by ensuring that Palestinian people obtain their legitimate right and the independence of their state on the 4th of June 1967 lines. We insist upon the renewal or the implementation of the activities of the Quartet for the peace process. And we are acting in line with Jordan, France and Germany within the Munich context to resume negotiations. Egypt has spared no effort to achieve a ceasefire. And we insist upon the protection of holy sites by the Hashemite guards so that the Palestinian people can establish their legitimate rights. Concessions must be made as a price to be paid for peace, so as to spare people from paying the heavy price of war, so that the future is a better one for the upcoming generations. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister of Egypt. Now, I speak in my capacity as the Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister. Mr. Secretary General, colleagues, I thank Secretary General Guterres, the Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, for their briefings. I listened very carefully to the statements by the Palestinian Foreign Minister, the Israeli Permanent Representative to the UN, and the Foreign Ministers of Egypt and Jordan. I also welcome the representatives of Algeria and the Arab League to today's open debate. The escalation of conflicts between Israel and Palestine has caused heavy casualties, including those of women and children. The situation is dangerous and urgent. It calls for an immediate ceasefire and stop of violence. The international community must take actions right now and make every effort to avert further deterioration of the situation, prevent the region from backsliding into turbulence, and protect people's lives. Colleagues, the Palestinian question remains at the heart of the Middle East situation. Without stability in the Middle East, there can hardly be tranquility in the world. Only when the Palestinian question is resolved in a comprehensive, just, and durable manner can lasting peace and common security be truly realized in the Middle East. In light of the current tensions, China would like to propose the following. First, a ceasefire and stop of violence is the most pressing task. The use of force cannot ensure peace, nor can violence bring tranquility. All they bring is more seeds of hatred. China strongly condemns violence against civilians, and we once again urge the parties of the conflict to immediately cease military actions and hostilities and stop such moves as airstrikes, ground offensives, and rocket launches that aggravate the situation. It is important that Israel exercise restraint, earnestly observe the relevant UN resolutions, stop the demolition of Palestinian homes and the eviction of the Palestinian people, discontinuing its settlement expansion, put an end to the violence, threats, and provocations against Muslims, and maintain and respect the historical status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Palestine also needs to avoid steps that may further escalate the situation, avert civilian casualties, and work for an immediate de-escalation. Second, humanitarian assistance is urgently needed. The concurrence of the COVID pandemic and conflicts and turbulence has made the humanitarian crisis all the more challenging for the region. The situation in the Gaza Strip is particularly worrisome. We urge Israel to earnestly fulfill its obligations under international treaties, promptly and fully lift the blockade on and besiege of Gaza, guarantee the security and rights of the civilians in the occupied Palestinian territory, and facilitate the access of humanitarian assistance. The international community should extend humanitarian aid to Palestine via multiple channels and continue to support the work of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, in an effort to improve the humanitarian situation in Palestine. The UN needs to play its coordinating role in planning for the international humanitarian emergency relief and make utmost efforts to avert a humanitarian disaster. Third, international support is a due obligation. The Security Council, shouldering the primary responsibility for safeguarding international peace and security, must take strong actions on the Palestine-Israel conflict, reiterate its firm support for the two-state solution, and do more to cool down the situation as soon as possible. China has been working with relevant countries on a Security Council press statement. Regrettably, simply because of the obstruction of one country, the Security Council hasn't been able to speak with one voice. We call upon the US to shoulder its due responsibilities, take a just position, and, together with most of the international community, support the Security Council in easing the situation, rebuilding trust, and advancing political settlement. We also support a more active role by the UN, the LAS, the OIC, and countries with important influence in the region. This will help galvanize more broad-based and effective efforts for peace. Fourth, the two-state solution is the fundamental way forward. Recent years have seen a derailment of the Middle East peace process. The relevant UN resolutions have not been effectively implemented. In particular, Palestine's right to establish an independent state has been persistently undermined, and the suffering of the Palestinian people further deepened, leading to the crisis we see today. What has happened proves once again that an enduring settlement can only be achieved.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to cut out of that United Nations security briefing. Just a couple of footnotes that I took whilst we see that China is still on the screen. China currently the chair of the UN Security Council. The first thing that they proposed, they asked for a ceasefire and stop all the violence from both sides. China also calling upon the US to shoulder its responsibility in what I could assume be help rein in the ally being Israel. Earlier, as the briefing started, we heard from the United Nations President himself saying the highest number of Palestinian fatalities have been recorded per day since the UN started recording deaths due to conflict in 2008. They've recorded about 5,000 Palestinian deaths since then. That is 2008 till 2021. 5,000 Palestinian deaths recorded since the UN started recording those deaths. And in this week alone, since the Israel-Palestinian tensions began, 188 Palestinians have been killed. Of those, 55 were children. 55. That means 30% of all those killed so far by those Israeli strikes have been children.